Hello, and welcome to your most obedient and humble servant. This is a women's history podcast where we showcase 18th and early 19th century women's letters that don't get as much attention as we think they should. I'm your host, Catherine Garrett. This week, I am very excited to introduce not one, but two special guests. Dora Petherbridge, the curator of United States and Commonwealth collections at the National Library of Scotland, and Dr. Patrick Hart, assistant professor in the Department of English Literature at Bilkent University, Ankara. He is founder and editor of the Journal of the Northern Renaissance. Dora and Patrick are here because they are two of the editors of Henrietta Liston's Travels, the Turkish Journals, 1812 through 1820, a scholarly edition of Henrietta Liston's journal and other writings on Turkey that relate to her time as a diplomat's wife in the Ottoman Empire. Thank you, Dora and Patrick, for joining me. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Dora, thank you so much for joining me today. Can you tell me a little bit about your work as the curator at the National Library of Scotland, as well as your work with Liston's papers?
Yes, well, in fact, usually I get only to work with print and not with manuscripts and archives. So my main job is to develop the National Library's printed international collections, specifically relating to the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Asia. But we have a special focus at the library on Scots travel and Scots abroad and the Scottish diaspora. So working my way kind of from that topic, I found Henrietta Liston and began working on her papers a few years ago, looking at her life in America, because that's where it ties to the kind of core of my role.
So, Patrick, I know your research background is in lyric poetry in England and Scotland in the Renaissance. How did you become involved in the Henrietta Liston project?
Quite by chance, really. So I was working on, I'm very interested in a sort of early 17th century Scottish poet, William Drummond of Hawthornden. And most of his papers are held at the National Library. So I was there on a fairly regular basis whenever I was back from Turkey. And one of these times when I was visiting the library to look at Drummond's manuscripts, I was chatting with Dora. We'd become friends a while before that when I was studying in Edinburgh. I think it was then she mentioned about that she was looking at travel writings and documents relating to Scottish travellers around Constantinople and Naples. So Liston was sort of flagged up as somewhere vaguely on the horizon, something I might want to look at some point. And then Dora started working on the Liston papers more seriously, and in particular on the American material. She mentioned to me all these papers relating to her time in Turkey, and that there's not nearly so much funding available, unsurprisingly, for work relating to Turkey and the Ottoman Empire compared to the money that's there for research on the early years of the United States. So I think it started one day. I just thought, well, I'll order up this manuscript, have a look out of curiosity. Maybe I'll know somebody who might be interested in working on it. And then I got sucked in. It was so fascinating. And this archive was so rich that it just seemed remarkable that nobody was working on this.
What I got, Patrick, is that it was remarkable that nobody was working on her time in the Ottoman Empire. The focus had been so much on the Listons in the United States, and the Ottoman side of the chapter of their story had been neglected. And really, it is richer in many ways than what we know about their time in the US, and they were certainly there for longer. They were spent longer in Turkey than they did in the US. It had just been slightly forgotten, I think, until Patrick came along and invigorated everybody.
And this archive, I think, Dora, am I right in saying that the official name of the archive is the Robert Liston papers?
Yeah, the Sir Robert Liston papers.
And this contains all the documents relating to Robert Liston's diplomatic career, and Henrietta's papers are sort of bundled in there, along with Robert's. Yeah, they're not a sort of separate archive within that.
And Robert has been quite well researched, way back, and his diplomatic papers are well known, but Henrietta's journals were not so well known.
I feel like that's a good sort of jumping off point to introduce Henrietta and Robert Liston to people who won't know who they are.
Well, I think one of the things that is important to say is we really only know about Henrietta. Well, we definitely only know about Henrietta because her life is recorded within her husband's papers. So that's how she exists for us as this extraordinary historical subject at all. She's not your usual candidate for research, literary research, historical research. She's middle class. She was born in Antigua in 1751. She was from a very ordinary family with no political links, no literary links, no diplomatic links, or certainly not aristocratic. And she was orphaned when she was 8. So she left Antigua to go and live with guardians in Glasgow in Scotland. She lived in kind of, very modest fashion in the east end of the city until she was 44 years old, just with her guardians. And she did not think that, she actually uses the phrase, she did not think that love and marriage were in her plan of happiness. She'd had her eye on Robert for a while, so she'd known him, I think from the 1780s, from her mid-30s perhaps. Although their courtship is slightly mysterious. That's one of the things that isn't documented so well in the archive. But she had very deep feelings for him. There's one letter which gives us evidence for that. And Robert was several years her senior, so he was well into his diplomatic career by the time she knew him. He had been posted all over Europe. And she certainly didn't think that her life was going to be transformed. And suddenly, and I'm not sure still quite how it happened, but in 1796, in February 1796, they got married in Glasgow. Robert had just been appointed British minister to the United States, second person to hold that position, obviously after the end of the War of Independence. And they got married and immediately left to sail to New York. And then that's her kind of entrance into the diplomatic world. And then she really starts to be seen in the archive. That's when her letters is suddenly, all there for us. Robert had a very long diplomatic career. So even though they married quite late on, she got almost 30 years worth of experience as a diplomat's consort.
Wow.
Yeah. Robert didn't retire till late on in his 70s. So they were quite senior, and she had this transformed life where she traveled extensively. And by the time we meet her in 1812 in the Ottoman Empire, she's been to the United States, to Canada, to the West Indies, to Sweden and Denmark and other places in Europe, has written journals, the American journals obviously, but also she's also done travel writing about Europe, and copious letters of hers exist documenting her life. The Listons kept everything, and it's vast really. There are 177 volumes of manuscripts, and it's everything from official dispatches and diplomatic documentation and all sorts of grand documents, and then teeny tiny little receipts or notes, very ephemeral materials that exist alongside and are is equally valued. So we have an amazing record of all of her choices and her relationships and her experiences, ranging from what she liked to buy, for her garden, to what she ate, and then her high-level kind of political interactions.
Do you get the impression that she was keeping this because she knew that this was historically significant and she intended for it to be published someday? I know a lot of travel diaries were written with the intention of being published at some point, or obviously is it a mix?
I think that's a question we've thought a lot about. In terms of the wider archive, they kept it as part of almost Robert's diplomatic duty to save everything that represented his financial expenditure while he was in post, all of his correspondence. So they did save all the paperwork from their lives equally. But then sitting within that, we have thought about whether the journals maybe were something different and whether she had, ideas for them.
Yeah, I speculated a little bit about this in the introduction to the book. My suspicion is that this wasn't intended for print publication, at least. The main manuscript of Liston's travel journal does look like it was at least intended initially to be perhaps a clean copy, written up to be perhaps shared in in an intimate family circle and perhaps among friends. She does make some reference to perhaps reading her journal with one of her friends in one of her letters home.
We've talked about the extent of these papers and how interesting they are. Can you give some examples of how you think they can be valuable to scholars of a variety of subjects?
So this is one reason that we realized fairly early on that we needed an expanded editorial team to deal with this, because these papers have so much potential for so many different fields, I think. Primarily, perhaps, firstly, diplomatic history. And so we were very lucky at Bill Kent University, where I work, in the history department, Kenneth Weisbrod, who's a diplomatic historian working on the new diplomatic history, which is a movement within diplomatic history that shifts the focus a bit from the sort of grand conferences and the men to a greater emphasis, I think, on para-diplomatic events, the diplomacy that happened behind the scenes, that often involved wives, consorts, family members, all those sort of social events and networks through which, in many cases, the real diplomacy happened, and I'm sure still happens. So Ken came on board and has contributed a really nice section to the introduction that looks at how Liston's journals and letters can inform work in that field of the new diplomatic history. I think for Ottoman historians of the Ottoman Empire, this is a fascinating resource. It's an outsider's eye in, but an outsider who clearly was plugged into the Ottoman world in ways that not many foreign visitors or residents were, I think. So we brought Özden Mercan came on board, and she's also contributed a section, a wonderful section to our introduction, giving some of the background to the Ottoman scene when the Listons arrive in 1812. Liston has lots to say, in particular, I think, about the minority communities in Istanbul, the Armenians, the Jews, the Greeks, and their relations to sort of power relations, power networks within the Ottoman Empire. So for historians, there's a huge amount there. Now, I'm not a historian, so I'm perhaps better placed to talk about how fascinating Liston is as a writer. And I think in particular as where she fits in travel writing, and particularly women's travel writing about the Orient, particularly the Ottoman Empire. Now, again, Liston is writing a little later than the sort of works I normally focus on. So Valerie Kennedy, another Bill Kane colleague, who's a real expert, she's written on Edward Said's Orientalism, and I think this ties into debates about Orientalism in some very interesting ways. But in particular, Valerie's really sort of situated Henrietta Liston's writing in relation to earlier and later women's travel writing about Turkey. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who is a fascinating foil for Liston because she's writing 100 years earlier. She too is an ambassador's wife in Istanbul. But also writers who are perhaps slightly less well known, like Elizabeth Craven, Julia Pardo, and Annie Jane Harvey, all of whom published travelogues about their experiences traveling to Turkey and living there.
Fascinating. I like the point you mentioned earlier about how diplomacy is not necessarily, there's a lot of, obviously men were diplomats, but a lot of diplomacy does happen at things like dinner parties and places where women would be involved. And from what Dora said earlier, it doesn't seem particularly surprising that maybe someone who's been made a diplomat might get married pretty quick before over there for the help. I think that's obviously, that seems to me like maybe one of the reasons they got married.
Yes, no, I think that is likely, especially going to the United States at that time. I think it was felt that maybe it was time for Robert to, have somebody with him to socialize with, and meet Martha Washington and all the other women of Philadelphia and New York. Yeah.
And this is slightly off topic, but just really quickly, when you're talking about women's travel writing sort of as a style, is there something that does Liston sort of fit the sort of bill for the way women generally write about travel, or is there anything sort of unique about the way that she wrote about?
Ooh, that's a big question.
Yeah.
And Valerie would be better placed to answer it than I am, I'm afraid. But I mean, what's really fascinating for me is the contrast with somebody like Mary Wortley Montagu, who, again, sort of connecting with what Dora was saying before, Montagu is aristocratic, witty, capable of being very dismissive.
Connected, very well connected.
Absolutely. Yeah. Whereas Liston's much more grounded, much less interested in herself, perhaps. But I think as well, I mean, the Listons also were in Norway and Sweden. Denmark, am I right?
Denmark, yeah.
Liston also wrote about her experiences there. And they make a fascinating contrast or comparison with Mary Wollstonecraft, who, of course, wrote famous letters from her travels there. But again, I mean, I wouldn't want to claim that Liston is in the same order of writing as Mary Wollstonecraft, but it is fascinating to see how much she's sort of turned outward towards the world she's seeing, far less introspective, at least in these journals.
Interesting. It sounds like maybe there's a little bit of something to argue about class in the comparisons and things like that as well.
Absolutely, I think. I think it's perhaps also significant that there's, the question of age. Liston's in her 60s when she travels, whereas Wollstonecraft and Lady Mary Montagu are both in their 20s.
I'd probably be writing more about myself in my 20s as well. So now to sort of focus in on the particular letter that we're going to be reading today. So she's writing to her nephew, Dick Ramage, March 6th, 1813. Mm-hmm. So what is going on in Liston's life at this moment?
Well, she's been in Constantinople in Turkey for about 9 to 10 months. So she and Robert arrived in the summer of 1812. Great ceremonial arrival, rode up the Bosphorus at the expense of the Sultan, a whole kind of ceremonial event. And then quite quickly, they are pretty much in lockdown in the British Embassy because there's a significant plague outbreak in the city of Constantinople. It was one of the most severe epidemics, actually, that coincided with almost all of their time in the city. So there's that to deal with, as well as being new to Turkey. They're dealing with this epidemic. And Henrietta's also at this time learning the ropes of the European diplomatic corps in Constantinople, finding, as we'll see from the letter, who she can and can't socialize with, who their allies are and who their enemies are. Robert says something quite interesting about Henrietta during their Turkish chapter. He says that she's a good diplomatic consort and that she has to keep up a friendly intercourse with all mankind. So this is her main job, is to be hostess and friend and imparter of information and, offerer of entertainment for all the merchants and diplomats and travellers and artists who are passing through the British Embassy doors. And there were all sorts of people coming to the Listons for help and assistance and entertainment and hospitality. The other thing is about Henrietta. She's a botanist. She's a really, really keen, skilled botanist. And one of the things she did when she came back from the US is create an American garden at her home in Scotland, Millburn Tower. And so she's sending specimens of plants and seeds and bulbs back from wherever she is in the world to that garden and cultivating a really international, almost like a botanical journal. So she does mention the garden, the embassy garden, and that was one of her main amusements when she was in Turkey, and quite a significant undertaking, I think, and it became quite famous for how well it was planted. So yeah, she's handling all sorts, as well as the political situation overarching everything.
I was not expecting to hear that she started a garden during this time. That actually,
yeah,
that's really interesting. So just for a little bit more context, can you tell me anything about her nephew and her relationship with her nephew who she's writing to?
So Dick Ramage is one of Robert Liston's 5 nephews. The time she's writing to him, Dick is about 36 years old, and he's looking after the Liston's estate, Milburn Tower, which is just outside Edinburgh in Scotland. So when they correspond with him, there's often a lot of exchange of news from home, how things are going on the estate, family news, neighbours, events in neighbours' lives, that kind of thing. But this letter shows us that she's also updating really her whole family, as well as Dick, on how they're getting on at the Sublime Porte in Constantinople. I think that they were relatively close. We don't actually know an awful lot about Dick Ramage. He died just a few years after this letter was written, so he died relatively young. But she was quite close to all her nephews, and definitely grieving when Dick died of consumption. But I think their main exchanges, looking at their correspondence overall, is about Henrietta's beloved garden. That's really where they chat the most in the 20 or so letters that still exist between them. But this is the best letter.
Definitely the best one. So that's sort of the personal life who she's writing to. What are the major political issues that are relevant to Constantinople at this time?
In terms of Ottoman politics, you've got Mahmud II is Sultan, a man Liston describes in a journal as a man of talents, but also a bigot. He's trying to put in place sort of new reforms, or really building on the reforms that his predecessor Selim III had put in, who tried to establish a new order, but who had been dethroned 6 years, 1807, 6 years previously, in a coup led by the Janissaries, and this was, the power of the Janissaries was a big sort of political issue that Mahmud II had to struggle with, and he eventually succeeds in disbanding the Janissaries. And so he's at this point he's really sort of reasserting reasserting the Sultan's authority in the Ottoman Empire. More internationally, of course, we've got, as we'll see, the war betwixt Russia and France. Napoleon's great disastrous invasion of Russia and the retreat from Moscow, and all the fallout that follows from that. Dora, do you want to say something about the ambassadors who are arriving?
Yes, so I think one of the issues that the Listons deal with is this issue of who they're against and who they're with. So in this letter, the French ambassador, Count Antoine Francois Andreossi, arrives, and this is a big occasion. His arrival's been anticipated, and he's certainly not on the same side as the Listons. So this is one of the issues in Constantinople, and one of the things that causes Robert Liston a great deal of trouble. So we hear about him in the letter. There's also the ambassador Italinsky, who is the Russian ambassador, who Robert Liston worked quite closely with, and he also is mentioned in the letter. So the Listons' status and place within the European diplomatic corps in Constantinople is shifting at this point, and still being negotiated and worked out in quite an urgent way.
Yeah, I think there's quite a delicate balancing game going on, especially in relations between Britain and Russia, wanting to keep Russia on side, but not allow Russian influence to expand too greatly.
And Robert Liston's kind of his main instructions really from the British government is he has to preserve peace and also protect the Anglo-Ottoman trading relationship. So those are his two main priorities. So that's also the background to their time there.
All right. Well, I think you've done a lovely job setting up the context. And let's dive into the letter.
Hera of Constantinople, 6th of March, 1813. My dear Dick, Your letter of July, which reached me, I think, in September or October, found us prisoners within our garden walls, and in all the horrors of apprehension, the plague having by that time completely surrounded us. Our back gate opened into a burying ground, in which the graves were so numerous and so fresh that it resembled a new ploughed field. By the by, in time of health, these burying grounds are extremely interesting, but become serious evils during the plague. When I say burying grounds, I talk of every empty space in the towns and their neighbourhoods. At each grave of any distinction, a stone is placed, on end, crowned with a turban which, from its form, denotes the rank of the deceased. The remainder is filled with inscription, generally passages from the Quran, and all is painted and gilded in the gayest manner. At the back of each stone there is a cypress of a magnificence to astonish. These cypresses form beautiful groves which are, in summer, filled with the turtle doves, whose constant melancholy note accords so sweetly with the cypresses, while the scene is so singularly enlivened by the painting and gilding of the turbans and inscriptions. During the plague, all this beauty for the time disappears. The bodies, and they often died 1,000 a day, are usually placed very little below the surface of the ground, and often without coffins. Sometimes the dogs, which form one of the nuisances of the country, dig them up, and at all times the heat occasions a smell worse than disagreeable, for it carries death along with it. From this shocking scene, we retired late in October to the village of Belgrade, 12 miles from Pera. Belgrade is the Elysian fields of Lady Wortley Montagu. It is, allowing for her high colouring, a very charming Greek village, in the midst of an immense forest, beautifully diversified, with green meadows, lakes, streams and fountains, and surrounded with wooded hills. This country certainly is the most beautiful in the world, but with 1,000 inconveniences and at least an equal number of uglinesses. I pass my hours pleasantly enough. I can and do read or write more than I ever did in the same space of time. We scarcely ever dine with our family alone, and seldom drink tea without company. We walk when the weather allows it, and then often make calls, for we pay no other visits, except in summer, to Bucdere, to the Russian, Spanish, Swedish, and Sicilian ministers. From all the rest of the diplomatic corps and their friends, the war excludes us. Our house is large and charming, our garden extensive, and we begin to dress it up. The view from the top of our house, even from the windows of our drawing rooms, is well worthy the pencil of an artist. We are out of your world, it is true, but we are in the Oriental one. The posts from Persia, from Baghdad, from Smyrna, vessels from the Greek and Mediterranean islands, all less or more interest us, to say nothing of that from Vienna, which gives us very early news from Paris. And just in the middle of that last sentence there, Henrietta writes in parenthesis, "We are now eating honey from Athens, the produce of Mount Hymettus, but alas, no butter."
Well, that's a good break point there. I think it's interesting that her description of the plague and the burial grounds are simultaneously so visceral, but also beautiful.
There's something funny about the way she sort of breaks off almost from this, as you said, this, the horror of this scene of, the back gate opening into a burying ground with these, fresh graves everywhere. And then just, oh, by the by, in time of health, these are extremely interesting, which I think is quite like her. She can break off in the midst of horrors.
So tell me more about this section of the letter. What strikes you as interesting?
I think it's what she talks about doing. It's her activities are quite revealing, and her detailing of who she sees and who she meets, which speaks to the shifting power relations, the Russian, the Spanish, the Sicilian ministers we can socialize with, but there are others who they could not. And then that wonderful sentence about "we are out of your world, it is true, but we're in the Oriental one." That standout sentence, how she's describing being in a different world from the one that her nephew inhabits back in Scotland. And that's also specific to her Turkish experience. About no other country does she ever write that.
Yeah. Well, and you brought up the word Orientalism came up earlier in the talk. As far as Liston's perspective of this Orient world that she is currently in, do you feel a lot of sort of judgment or alienness, or do you think she's honestly really trying to understand what's going on around her?
There's a contrast between her reactions to the real Turks she's meeting and how she'll write sometimes when she's taking a step back and describing the sort of the wider political scene or political events. I think in the second half of the letter we'll see a nice example of this. She can fall into the worst sort of orientalizing tropes from time to time, both in her letters and in her journals. But for the most part, she doesn't. She's genuinely curious and obviously relishes making human contacts with the Turks she meets, particularly Turkish women, I think. And there are a lot of moments I found quite moving, maybe all the more moving because they're written with a fair degree of sort of wry, ironic detachment in some cases, but still, despite all that, the sheer pleasure of communication and her appreciation for her hosts really, I think, really shines through.
You can get a little bit of a sense of humor coming through in a couple places there.
Yeah. I think I particularly like the kind of wry glance when she's referring to Lady Wortley Montagu. And again, I think someone who was more self-consciously literary in her writing might be more sort of caught up in how they were engaging with, say, Montagu's writings. Whereas I think for Liston, she clearly has an appreciation for Montagu. She's clearly read her. She alludes to her fairly frequently, I'd say, in her journals and her letters. But again, that sort of wry qualification, it is allowing for her high colouring a very charming Greek village. I think... And then, again, this is typical Liston, I think, because then she goes on to give a really sort of beautiful description. In the midst of an immense forest, beautifully diversified with green meadows, lakes, streams and fountains, and surrounded with wooded hills, you really get a sort of a picturesque vision with just a little hint of the sublime in that, image of the immense forest. I think she's a much better writer than I suspect she would give herself credit for. I'm tempted to say something about her love of honey and missing the butter, but maybe we can save that and see how we're doing.
That was very relatable. Alas, no butter.
Shall I continue, Catherine?
Yes.
Okay. But the circumstance which has most interested and occupied us is the war betwixt Russia and France. Bonaparte's being fairly beat off the field, half his army having perished in their retreat from cold and hunger, he must now, it is probable, yield to the wish of the Emperor of Austria, whose advice is a general peace and who stands in a position to enforce it. We are not without our political embarrass here. The Turks, besides their general contempt of all Christian powers, particularly hate the Russians and fear the French. England and Austria are the only governments they at all confide in. Andreossi arrived as ambassador extraordinary soon after us. Andreossi's first orders were to prevent the peace. For that, he was much too late, as Mr. Liston had been to make it. His most important step was to renew the war, and the Turks having in truth made a very disadvantageous peace, it required some address to counteract him. Thus the summer was passed in discontent, irritation, and ill humour. This was wound up by the two most atrocious executions of the Greek princes, Marousis, of all which I hope the French ambassador's conscience is clear, but I would not exchange consciences with him. Yet it must be confessed that this savage and despotic nation make less accounts of men's heads than of anything else in their kingdom. The late wonderful successes of the Russians against the French, aided by Talensky and Mr. Liston, begin to open the eyes of the Turkish government, and the ensuing summer must, I think, decide the fate of the world. If the French continue the war and conquer Russia, Turkey must fall, of course, and this the Sultan knows perfectly. The favourite point of Bonaparte's ambition being to be crowned Emperor of the East on the throne of the great Constantine. Did you make out your jaunt to England? Are you again in your own house? And what is more important, how is your health? And how is Sandy? For he says little of himself. Mr. Liston begs to be affectionately remembered to you all. I wrote to Sandy last week. Write soon and fully. Yours most affectionately, Henrietta Liston.
Well, that was a very well-written summary of politics at the time, I feel like. All right, so how accurate would you say Liston's take of the political scene is at this particular moment?
I think it's in some ways it's a difficult question to answer, but I think given what she could know at this time, and given the speed at which news moved or didn't move, yeah. I think for the most part she is fairly accurate. Certainly, her understanding of the sort of political situation of Andreossi's role seems to be fairly sharp. Andreossi, the French ambassador, when he'd come, he'd suggested that the Maurices, particularly Demetrius Marusi, who was the grand dragoman, the sort of translator, but a dragoman was also much more than that, that he had been in some ways pro-Russian. Well, certainly this was the report going round. And of course, that was a constant Ottoman fear, was that the Greeks within the Ottoman Empire and within the sort of Ottoman bureaucracy, and the Marusis are Phanariots, part of this the Greek elite within the Ottoman Empire. The suspicion is that partly on grounds of sort of religious kinship, if I can put it like that, that the Greeks might be inclined to favour the Russians. Ultimately, this resulted in these executions of the two Marusis, and her suggestions. She says, all of which I hope the French ambassador's conscience is clear, but I would not exchange consciences with him. I think she knows what's going on behind the scenes. She's experienced enough by this point to know how these things play out. She was clearly very shocked, I think, by these executions. Again, she hadn't come across anything quite like this, in America or in Denmark, I think, in her previous diplomatic career.
Yeah, her description of the savage and despotic nation makes less account of men's heads than of anything else in their kingdom. I think that's
yeah, it is absolutely, it's one of those Orientalist tropes you find again and again in sort of Western writing about the Orient, about the Ottoman Empire, that it's savage and despotic. And, I think this is unmistakably an example of it being just that. Of course, it would be fairly easy, I think, to say similar things about the British government at the same time. We're not lacking in examples. It's interesting, I think, as well. In her letters, she seems much more willing or much more likely to talk about politics and what's going on behind the scenes. And I'm not sure whether that's because she knows that her readership, her family, her friends back home are going to want that kind of news. That's what her journal is. She does go into these affairs, but in less detail on the whole.
There's a big concept of there being such a hard split between the public and the private world, and women being delegated entirely to private. But just from my work in reading women's letters from this time period, it seems like there's usually a healthy mix of these going on. In these letters, when people are writing to their families, they of course want to update with family news, but there's also just news. And obviously her position as a diplomat's wife makes that all the more relevant and her more knowledgeable about it. But I think this is just a great letter. And there's that little mix of family news and questions about people's health that you always get in these letters.
She's absolutely unapologetic about talking about politics as well.
To either of you, what is something that you think is really significant about this letter that it'll add to the historical record that you think people might get out of it?
One thing is what we've just been talking about.
Yes. Yeah.
That willingness to talk about politics, the way she's working in these, paradiplomatic situations, spheres.
how informed she was. Yeah, how informed she was, how confident, and writing with an authority of knowledge, and a definite sense of her place within everything, and her joinedness to Robert in what they were doing, and both of them as a couple being this influential force. And that's quite remarkable for a woman who didn't come from any background of influence.
I think the way she so often writes we rather than I, or Mr. Liston, my husband is doing this. It's time and time again in both the journals and letters, it's we.
And anything particularly evocative.
Well, Patrick, when you and I were talking earlier about the kinds of subjects she covers in this letter, it's that, I think we've touched on this before, but it's the combination of the high stakes and then the very kind of natural everyday occurrences, which is how we all communicate with each other, and that kind of connectedness of all those things. But also, for us now, all of these international relationships, Turkey and Russia, and the plague, an epidemic, a pandemic, it's got so many resonances, this letter, for us. Yeah, surprising number of things that have not changed, actually.
Not being able to socialize.
Yeah, being confined to your garden walls or, flat apartment, yeah.
So you're coming out with a print edition of Henrietta Liston's Travels, the Turkish Journals, 1812 through 1820. But that is also paired with a larger digital project. So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes, what we wanted to do is to make the original manuscripts digitized and available alongside the printed version that's just been published. So I think, Catherine, you mentioned earlier that we had digitized and put available online all of the American writings that Henrietta produced, and they've now been joined by the collection of digitized Turkish journals to coincide with the publication of this book. But that also informed our editorial decisions.
One reason we did this is partly because I think this is interesting material for scholars working in so many different fields, and also just general readers, that certainly some scholars sort of more interested in textual studies, in women's manuscripts, we knew would want to see the manuscripts themselves. And so it was really important to us to make those available, and it's worth mentioning maybe that they're all open access, freely available online. And the manuscripts are just fantastic as well. They're full of, you do get a different sense, I think, from reading them, with all her, to our eyes now, I think, eccentric underlinings, the marginalia, the little insertions. But these do mean that it's, especially for the reader not used to manuscripts, it's a challenge to read. And I was also very aware that this was likely to be of interest to Turkish readers. And that text, even with a transcription alongside, it's not accessible to everybody, and it's even for myself, it's not something that's always easy to read for pleasure, and that's why we decided to go for a modernized text within the book to make something as readable as possible.
Alongside that coupling of print and digital, we wanted to give other perhaps non-academic readers different ways in to Liston's texts. So we've got a collection of long reads and creative responses on the online resource from journalists and novelists and scholars, people who could bring different perspectives to Liston's writing. And so they're there to widen the context and to give people different points of access. And we've also created a digital mapping application which covers Liston's American travels and her travels through Europe to the Ottoman Empire. And so using that, people can then visualize exactly where she was and click through from specific places on the map to her descriptions of them in the digitized manuscripts. So we try to really kind of break open the manuscripts with all these different responses and applications, digital applications.
That is fantastic. I think we're really entering some of the big questions of documentary editing and making manuscripts available to the public and different ways of coming at a manuscript. So this all is very exciting. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine.
Great fun.
To my listeners, thank you very much for listening to another episode. I will have show notes and links to some of these exciting projects in the show notes and on the webpage. So as always, I am, as ever, your most obedient and humble servant. Thank you very much.